So it's 2 weeks since we met. And the last couple of times we were looking at how David eventually became king over Israel. And he was living in a grand palace in Jerusalem. And then we saw how he wanted to build a temple for God, but he was told no, that would be his son Solomon's job. And God made a promise, a covenant with David, that he would establish the house of David as the throne of his kingdom forever. And we saw how David's heart was that he wanted God's name to be great. And the promise that we saw, it was in chapter 7, verse 25, we saw this. It's what David said. He said, Lord God, keep forever the promise you have made concerning your servant and his house. Do as you promised, so that your name will be great forever. Then people will say, the Lord Almighty is God over Israel. And of course, that was ultimately the promise that salvation would come from David's line through the birth of the Messiah. And we're going to be looking in 2 Samuel chapter 8 today, which tells us a bit more about how that kingdom was established. And I think we need to bear in mind as we read chapter 8, these events took place about 1000 BC, so it's about 3000 years ago, when life and the world, the way things work, were quite different from today. People were still the same, but the circumstances were perhaps slightly different. Now, I haven't asked anyone to read this because it's got lots of names. I thought I'd be kind, so you're gonna have to put up with me reading through this, because I've had a chance to practice. So it's 2 Samuel chapter 8. This is what we hear. In the course of time, David defeated the Philistines and subdued them, and he took Metheg-Anna from the control of the Philistines. David also defeated the Moabites. He made them lie down on the ground and measured them off with a length of cord. Every 2 lengths of them were put to death, and the 3rd length was allowed to live. So the Moabites became subject to David and brought him tribute. Moreover, David defended Hadadezer, son of Rehab, king of Zobar, when he went to restore his monument on the Euphrates River. David captured 1,000 of his chariots, 7,000 charioteers, and 20,000 foot soldiers. He hamstrung all but 100 of the chariot horses. When the Aramaeans of Damascus came to help Hadadezer, king of Zobar, David struck down 22,000 of them. He put garrisons in the Aramaean kingdom of Damascus, and the Aramaeans became subject to him and brought him tribute. The Lord gave David victory wherever he went. David took the gold shields that belonged to the officers of Hadadezer and brought them to Jerusalem. From Tebah and Berothai, towns that belonged to Hadadezer, King David took a great quantity of bronze. When Tou, king of Hamath, heard that David had defeated the entire army of Hadadezer, he sent his son Joram to King David to greet him and congratulate him on his victory in battle over Hadadezer, who had been at war with Tou. Joram brought with him articles of silver, of gold, and of bronze. King David dedicated these articles to the Lord, as he had done with the silver and gold from all the nations he had subdued: Edom and Moab, the Ammonites and the Philistines, and Amalek. He also dedicated the plunder taken from the Hadadezer, son of Rehob, king of Zobar. And David became famous after he returned from striking down 8,000 Edomites in the Valley of Salt. He put garrisons throughout Edom, and all the Edomites became subject to David. The Lord gave David victory wherever he went. So we'll just finish it there for the time being. And let's just think about what we're told about all that was going on here. First off, what about the time scale of these conquests? In verse 1. You're going to have to unmute for me to hear any answers here. What was the time scale of these events?
In the course of time, I've got in here.
I don't know if anyone's talking, but I can't hear it.
Oh, can't you hear me? Can you hear me?
I think if you want to talk, answer, you have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'm unmuted. Right? Can you not hear me?
Okay, well, I'll read.
I could hear you, Verena.
Okay, it says, right, that was somebody. Is somebody going to shout out? No?
Okay.
I'll carry on then. So
Verena's actually answering you.
Verse 1, it tells us yeah, okay, thanks, Verena. That's right, over the course of time. I can hear you, Verena, yes. Can you hear me? No.
I think there seems to be a delay.
Yes, I can hear you, yeah.
Oh.
Yep, so can I.
In the course of time, it says.
Can you hear me, Carol? Right, can you hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you.
Carol, can you hear me? No.
There seems to be like a delay or something going on.
You're frozen, Sue.
Sue is freezing.
Yes,
right.
Yes. I can hear what she's saying.
Okay. Over the course of time, yeah. So this chapter then is not sort of events one after the other. It's showing how going on. Help. Oh dear. Oh, I don't know what to do about that. Unless I move there. Do you want me to try on my other machine, Carol?
Yeah.
I can try on the other one.
Have a try on the other one.
I suggest, Sue, are you plugged in or are you using Wi-Fi?
Who said that?
That was Tammy.
Tammy, it's always better if you've got a cable connection to your internet.
Or you have to be close to your Wi-Fi.
It's on Wi-Fi, yeah. Yeah, it has. Oh no. Yeah, it's been all right before, hasn't it?
Right, Sue's coming in on another device, so I think it's probably Wi-Fi issues, isn't it? Yeah. Right, we'll see if this works. Sue's hopefully logging in. Oh, there's.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, that's much better.
Yes.
I don't know what that's about. Okay, it's on a different machine. Oh, sorry about that. So I've lost me. There it is. Okay, so we'd only just read through the passage up to the last few verses, and we were just looking at what the time scale of all these conquests was really. And Verena had said in the course of time. So I think that's important to remember. It wasn't sort of one after the other. These events that we've written here, these battles and what have you, happened over a matter of years. I think it was the in those days, in the springtime, armies of countries went out to war. It's what they did, and then they had sort of the winter time off. So all these things that we're reading about happened over quite a while. So we're going to look at the people groups that that God gave David victory over, and I think Carol's got a map which hopefully might come up to look at this. And you can just be looking in the passage, look at the different groups of people that that David battled over, and then we'll have a look on a map.
Everyone see that?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, good. So let's just orientate ourselves. That bit of blue on the back is on the left-hand side is the Mediterranean Sea. The top, there's a bit of blue, that's the Sea of Galilee. It's got a blue line that runs down, that's the River Jordan, goes down to the Dead Sea there. And to the left of the Dead Sea, can you see Jerusalem? That's where David's palace is, that's where he's the centre of Israel at this time. So who are the people then who he managed to the people groups, the names of the people that are mentioned that he was able to battle against? Will someone shout out, and hopefully I can hear you. Somebody got one of them?
The Moabites.
Philistines.
Okay, let's take the Philistines first of all. And if you look on that map, you can see an arrow going out from Jerusalem to the left towards the Mediterranean Sea. And that's the area where the Philistines were, in the west there. Can you see that? Okay, so that was one group. And somebody else? Who else was there?
The Moabites.
Okay, Moabites. Okay, so the Moabites are, if you look to the right of Jerusalem, it goes over the top of the Dead Sea and down a bit. And there you can see we have the Moabites there. All right, so that's to the east. And who else do we have?
Ammonite.
Ammonites. Okay, so we've got Philistines, Moabites. The Ammonites are also sort of right and up a bit. I think that might be northeast. So northeast there, up to the Ammonites. Okay, carry on.
Arameans.
The Arameans. Okay, so the Arameans are up in what is current day Syria, up towards Damascus, which is actually off this map, but the arrow that's going right up there, up past Dan, carry on going up there, and you get all the way to current day Syria, which is where the Arameans were. And also, you might not be quite clear, but the king of Zobar, he also was up that way. There was two cities up in, I don't know how you say it, anyway, where Aramea, maybe. They were up there where Hadadezer, king of Zobar, was up there. I think it mentions, doesn't it, up to the Euphrates River. So the Euphrates River runs across from Iraq, across north of Syria, and across to the sea, just a bit above that map. So that's right up north. So that was, they were battling up there. So anywhere else that we've not mentioned? I can see a couple more, I think. We've got Edomites, yes. Yeah. So the Edomites were descended from Esau, remember back in Genesis, and they're down right at the bottom there of the Dead Sea. The Moabites and Edomites and Ammonites are in current day with Jordan, and the Edomites, I don't know if anyone's been there, but it's near where the city of Petra is. If you ever go to Jordan or have been there, the Rose Red City, because Edom was meant red, and the land there, the sea, the ground is very, very red. Anyway, if you've never heard of Petra or that, you won't know what I'm talking about. If you have, it's interesting to know that that's where the Edomites were in that day. And so I think there might be one group we haven't mentioned.
The
Yeah.
Amalekites.
The Amalekites, yeah. So they're the ones who are right down in the south there, towards current day Saudi Arabia. So we see that, in fact, these campaigns of David's are going out north, south, east and west, aren't they, to really establish Jerusalem and Israel as the capital city over a large area. And of course that goes back to the covenant, the promise that God gave to Abraham, that he would give them the land there that he could see. So it's an enormous area. I think if it goes from up in Syria right down to Saudi Arabia, so it's a large area. Okay. So what are the riches then that David captures?
Do you want me to stop sharing soon?
Yeah, we're probably finished with the map now, haven't we? Yeah. What are the riches that that David captures then?
Silver, gold, and bronze.
Right.
In verse
Silver.
10.
Yeah. Silver, gold, and bronze.
Bit like the Olympics. Sorry.
I read somewhere, interestingly, that in these days silver was more valuable than gold.
Oh,
Which is why it's put first. But I've never heard that. But I mean, obviously, the value of a metal is based on how much you've got of it. So maybe they got more gold than they had silver. But that's a bit of an aside. But anyway, interesting to think things can be different. Okay, so yeah, in verse 10, yeah, we've got articles of gold, silver, and bronze. And what about in verse 7? What have we got there?
The gold shields.
Gold shields and bronze. So basically, from all of these people that that they captured and raided, he took vast quantities of bronze and silver and gold. And what does David do with all these valuable things that he captured?
He dedicated the articles to the Lord.
It tells us that in verse 11, doesn't it? Absolutely. He dedicated these articles to the Lord. So what's that really telling us then about why David's taking all this stuff?
He didn't really want it for himself, but he wanted it for the Lord.
He did, didn't he? And yeah. And go on.
It could be used for the building of the temple.
Absolutely, yes, that's right. So in Chronicles, in 1 Chronicles 18, you can look perhaps later, it gives us a very similar account to this, with a few extra little bits that you can glean from it. And it tells us in 1 Chronicles 18, verse 8, we read this: David took a great quantity of bronze, which Solomon used to make the bronze sea, the pillars, and various bronze articles. So, yeah, so the articles were dedicated to God at this time, and then later they were used to adorn the temple that was going to be built in the future. So you see there's a sort of purpose in this, isn't there? David's not doing it to become rich for his own sake. Yeah. And if we look in verses 6 and 14, what reasons do we have for how David was so successful?
The Lord who gave him the victory.
Yeah, absolutely. The Lord gave David the victory. Yeah.
He established garrisons there, presumably to safeguard it.
That's right. There were little groups of soldiers placed in these places. It was a very like military strategy, wasn't it? That they go out and have these battles, and then they set up the garrisons to do that. And in 2 places, I think we read in verse 2 about the Moabites, and somewhere else. What did the people who David conquered, what did they do for David? I think verse 2, it tells us about the Moabites, and somewhere else. And in verse 6, yeah,
They brought a tribute to him.
they brought a tribute to him. Now that's like a kind of tax. So basically it's showing that they accepted David's rule, and they paid their taxes and their tributes and their dues, and they became part of David's kingdom, and they sort of settled down under that at this particular time in history anyway.
It's interesting to remember that Ruth was a Moabitess, David's great grandma.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And just mentioning that, I mean, I guess when we read sort of chapter like this, it's a bit sort of, it sounds a bit barbaric, doesn't it? I mean, I suppose it is barbaric actually to our way of thinking, to go out and to do all this. But we have to remember, don't we, that back in the day of, Joyce mentioned the Moabites, that they were a very, very wicked, if you like, nation. They had child sacrifice, they had temple prostitution. It was a very, very society that was completely away from God. No, God wasn't in the midst of them at all. And they were evil. And as such, they've been dealt justice by God, haven't they, at this time? Are there any sort of questions around any of those things that anyone would like to ask?
I suppose it just seems so inhuman. I mean, they're even the horses are being killed, and I think, well, the horses haven't done anything.
Yeah, it tells us, doesn't it, that the horses were hamstrung, and apparently that's not killing them. It's taking out the tendon behind their knees, so they can't run fast. And so again, in all of this, we can obviously read that a number of those people that David was fighting, there were chariots and charioteers, but the Israelites didn't have chariots or charioteers. They were foot soldiers, okay? And apparently doing this to the horses would just mean that they couldn't be used as army horses, but they were probably used, in the fields. They weren't killed. They could be used, but just they couldn't pull chariots and things. So I guess that makes a little bit more. Yeah.
I don't think it does. I mean, I don't know whether I'm just the only one, but it kind of doesn't sit comfortably, does it?
No.
And I suppose the nearest I get is thinking of countries like Great Britain going to war against someone like Hitler. And it's sometimes the I don't know, the lesser evil, the greater good. I don't know. I have to say I struggle, and you just have to come back to the fact that God is good and just and loving. But I have to say, it's the thing about these people lying down and being measured off and killed. And okay.
Yeah, so a third of them were allowed to live and 2/3 of them were killed, to bring them under a size, I suppose, that was, manageable. But I mean, as I said, it happened a long time ago, and to our way of thinking, we don't understand it. But yet we can read that God was behind this. And I mean, I guess as well, it goes back when they first went into the promised land, back with what Moses had said back in Deuteronomy. Remember when they were going into the promised land, we can read in Deuteronomy 7 It says, when the Lord your God brings you to the land you're entering to possess and drives out before you many nations, lots of them, and when the Lord your God has delivered them over to you and you've defeated them, it says, make no treaty with them, show them no mercy, don't intermarry with them. Because it says, for they will turn your children away from following me to serve other gods, and the Lord's anger will burn out against them. This is what you are to do. Break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, cut down their Asherah poles and burn their idols in the fire. For you're a people holy to the Lord your God, and the Lord has chosen you out of all the peoples in the face of the earth to be his treasured possession. So again, these people were completely against God, and as such, they had no place. They had rejected God. And if you think as well that in the world today, we all have the opportunity now, don't we, to come to God, to come through Jesus. But if ultimately people reject that and don't come, then the end isn't pleasant. God has got to judge. He has got to bring justice. And yeah, I think we've turned away from that idea really a bit in our modern culture, in our modern thinking. But that is what the Bible teaches us. As much as we don't. Yeah.
I was just going to say, he was still merciful, because like in Jericho, Rahab, she wasn't one of God's people, but he still allowed her to be saved.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we and Ruth as well, you see, out of the Moabites. And actually, so those people were chosen, weren't they? Because God could see their hearts. Yeah. And I think even though we read, I think particularly about the women and children, when we know they've been killed. I mean, God ultimately will deal with them, even though that He can see what's in them. And we just don't know, do we, how God has judged those people? We can't assume they've all been. Put it this way, death isn't the end, is it? We know there's beyond that, and God chooses whom He chooses, and within that, if there are people whose hearts wanted to follow Him, even though they were in foreign nations, then they can come to Him. We have to trust them, don't we, too?
I can't remember the names of them, but I think there were some groups of people that God actually said, because they kind of turned to Him, then they kind of became friends, if you like, of the Israelites. So I think you're right. I think God does give the opportunity for people to turn, but at the end of the day, He's a God who will execute judgment because He's totally righteous. And you're right. We've got to face it.
Yeah, I think it's either in Genesis or Exodus. There's a part that says that God waited 400 years to deal with these people until their wickedness had become so great. God had to deal with it. So His mercy was there, because God's mercy is always tempered. His justice is always tempered with mercy. So although we read this, God had actually waited a long time, and any who would turn to Him, He would have accepted. But it tells us that He waited all that time until their wickedness was so bad, God had to deal with them. So I think that helps us a little bit.
It's interesting as well, because back in Genesis again, when the Israelites were in capture in Egypt, when the plagues came and to turn the Israelites back to God, it appears also that some Egyptians also became accepted to God and became part of the people who escaped from Egypt, from the Pharaohs. It's complicated. It is there in the if you read into it, that some people who weren't God's people became part of God's people because they believed in the God when they saw all the plagues and they saw what God was doing. So there is always a chance, yeah. Anne.
Well, doesn't it say somewhere God takes no pleasure in the death of the wicked? And I think that's what we've got to bear in mind. He's not there enjoying, rubbing his hands with glee. He does this with sorrow.
Absolutely, yeah.
The other thing that struck me, Sue, when you were talking about the spoils that David took, a lot of that would have come from Gentile people, but they would be used in the temple eventually. And it struck me that, of course, the temple was a house of prayer for all nations, which is lovely, isn't it?
Okay, yeah. So although they took the gold, this gold that was used for shield, it was used for the battles, they weren't allowed ever to take goods that had been sacrificed to the idols. So when David took stuff from the Philistines, they had to burn all the stuff that had been offered to foreign gods, because in a way I suppose it's tainted, but this other stuff appears just to have been used for war, but it hadn't been offered to idols, and there seems to be a difference in that. Okay, so let's have a look then at the there's a little bit at the end of this chapter. Then we think we're down to verse 15. Again, it's got lots of names. I don't like to land on somebody to read it. I'll do it for you. So 2 Samuel 8 verse 15, we hear, David reigned over all Israel, doing what was just and right for all his people. Joab, son of Zeruiah, was over the army. Jehoshaphat, son of Ahilud, was recorder. Zadok, son of Ahitub, and Ahimelech, son of Abiathar, were priests. Sariah was secretary. Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, was over the Kerethites and Pelethites. And David's sons were royal advisors. In the Chronicles version, in 1 Chronicles 14, it says, David's sons were chief officials at the king's side. I think some versions say priests, but they were different from the Levitical priests. It's obviously, I don't know in translation, but yeah, chief officials anyway. So this is, after all these battles and things and years down the line, what insight do we get into David's rule as king?
He was a good and just and fair king.
Okay, thank you, Leslie. Yeah. Good, just and fair. What jobs are we told that there were for people? What jobs are there?
Recorder.
Okay, not a recorder, but a recorder.
No, recorder, yes.
So what do you think the recorder did, Leslie?
Record all that happened in the kingdom.
Okay. And why was that quite important?
Yeah.
Well, just think, I mean, one of them was called the Chronicler, and he wrote the Book of Chronicles, and obviously this. So it's why
it's important in this sort of, when you look at history, because the kings that came after David, those who didn't follow God, didn't have the victories that David had. But this is all written down here, so they had no excuse. They could have seen that, when the king followed God's will and was faithful to God, he gave the country success and gave the kings success and victories. So in a way, it's sort of a message for those coming after him of what they should be doing.
Absolutely.
Mostly ignored.
And of course, it's a message. It's recorded for us in history today, isn't it? We're having this Bible study this morning because we've got these records that were written down by, at that time by people who scribed and wrote down all these events. So, yeah. So that was the recorder. Who else have we got?
The priests.
Yes, the priests, and they would be the Levitical priests with where's his name gone? Well, we won't worry about the names. They were different people. So I think you might have heard of Zadok the priest. I don't know if it's the same one, but Zadok was known as a priest, wasn't he? The Levite people. So they were to do what? What was their job?
Help the people to worship God.
Help the people to worship God and to offer sacrifices, wasn't it? In the temple. That was part of their rule, putting, bringing the sacrifices before God, as was required in those days. So that was the priests. And we've got a recorder, we've got priests, and we've got
secretary.
A secretary. Yes. To what do we think the secretary did?
Send out agendas for meetings.
Absolutely. Sounds very 20th
By email.
By email. Yeah.
The gopher.
The gopher. Oh my goodness, I like it. Yeah, I mean, all of these things that were happening in this, what was now a time of peace and a time of, growth, all of these events seemed to be fairly, all these people were doing roles that kept things in order, didn't they? They, kept a record of who was doing what in which part of the kingdom, and maybe organised elections and things. You never know. But yeah.
Would you say it also reminds them how much they need God and that they need to keep being obedient to His ways?
I'm not sure the secretary would do that, would they?
No, I just mean all of them.
Yeah.
So like the whole, not just the secretary, but all of them, especially the priests, and just having it in order so they know who they need to look to. And
in fact, I think orderly is the word that came to me when you read this, how David was doing things. It just seemed to be orderly, doesn't it? And even the fact that we've got here an army chief. David wasn't doing it all. He was delegating. Right, you're the army chief, you go and do that. You're the secretary, you do that. You're the record. And, it was ordered. It wasn't just a sort of ad hoc administration. It was government, wasn't it, really?
So,
yeah.
When it says that David reigned over all Israel, doing what was just and right for all his people, presumably that includes doing what was just and right for the peoples that he conquered.
Oh, absolutely.
So I think, again, that is great, isn't it? So he's actually, in the end, the people he's conquered have benefited by his reign.
Absolutely. Yeah. And although we struggle over all these names that we just had to read through, they're not sort of like Jack and Jill names, are they? But what for us does it tell us about all these events when you've got those names? I think it's just that they were real historical people. It's not, it's events of history, and these were the names of the people who did those things. I think it was just that. And I mean, we should sort of touch on this. I mean, what particularly marked David's reign was the fact that he did, didn't he, what was just and fair and right for the people. And I wonder if those ideas, fairness, justice, righteousness, remind you of anyone else in the Bible that we hear about. Where do those attributes come from? This is easy. It's a Sunday school answer.
God.
Yes. So they are the attributes, aren't they, of our God. If we look back to the time of Moses in Deuteronomy again, this is what Moses told the people they were to do. And this is going back before when they were doing the judges. He says that they were to appoint judges and officials for each of the tribes in every town for the Lord your God is giving you, and they shall judge the people fairly. They're to follow justice and justice alone, so that you may live and possess the land the Lord your God is giving you. And that's what they were told to do. And then also in Deuteronomy chapter 32, this is what Moses says about God. He says this, I'll read this to you. Deuteronomy 32 and verse 3, Moses says, I will proclaim the name of the Lord. Oh, praise the greatness of our God. He is the rock. His works are perfect and all his ways are just. A faithful God who does no wrong, upright and just is he. So those were the attributes, weren't they, of God? And just as a closing thing here, it's quite interesting. Like I said before, the Psalms obviously were written by, a lot of them were written by David. And in Psalm 72, we can actually read part of David's prayer for his son Solomon, who came after him. And this is what he said. Endow the king with your justice, O God, the royal son with your righteousness. May he judge your people in righteousness, your afflicted ones with justice. May he defend the afflicted among the people and save the children of the needy. May he crush the oppressor. So we see, can't we, that David was a good king because he modelled himself on God. His heart was after God, and he wanted here to make sure that his son continued in that way. So I think it's quite interesting passage. But I think even if we just learn that you know, when we look around the world today, we must pray for justice, for righteousness, and ask that pray that God will appoint people like that to be fair to all the people, not just, you know, the haves and the have-nots. That God wants a society that is equal, that is just, and that's what we should look for. And I don't know, when I read that bit, I mean, a song came to my mind, so I have asked Carol if we can perhaps listen to the words of this song. It's ascribed greatness to our God, the rock. And maybe so that's, which is based on those words, those verses in Deuteronomy. And maybe as we listen to it and think there, let's praise God that he is that God. He is our rock. He is just. And maybe we can pray as well that those qualities will become more evident in our current world rulers, that we would strive for that. So let's just finish by listening to the words of that song. Thanks, Carol.